In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. For weeks now, we've been hearing things like, keep awake, keep watch, a path has been prepared, and the Master, the Lord, is coming. You don't know the hour or the day, but just stay ready. We got some ideas about the kind of stuff that is worth getting on with whilst we wait, but we may not have a clear idea of what to watch for. There are always some Christians who are ready to make definitive claims about the timing of the return of Christ and offer what they think are authoritative interpretations about what the signs are. But I've never been one of them, and thus far, given that predictions about when Christ will come have a 100% strikeout rate, I'm quite content to just get on with things. But nevertheless, watching, looking, seeing is all very important and not to be taken for granted. Having the eyes to see, ears to hear, and even hearts ready to make room reflect a very commendable, prayerful disposition for a follower of Jesus. Having eyes to see. Now I'm going to state something blindingly obvious, pardon the pun, but it's good to be reminded. When John the Baptist makes his way onto the scene that we heard today, and Jesus shortly thereafter, both of those men were about 30 years of age. 30 years of life. I wonder how many people took notice of those two men as they grew up and took their place in society. Was there anything discernibly different? Did they have eyes to see that? Was John always a bit of an eccentric character with a prophetic streak, such that those close to him recognised that in his childhood or late teens or early 20s? For those 30 years, what did people see when they looked at John? Now obviously at this stage the religious authorities had become curious enough and took his movement serious enough to send priests and Levites to find out more about him and just who he thought he was. They didn't write him off just because of his particular love for garments made of camel hair, or the fact that he was the peak connoisseur of locusts and presumably other forms of insects in the region. Delicious. Indeed, on the face of it, it would have been easy enough to just ignore this rather bizarre character if we focused on the surface details. So what did people start to see beneath the surface? What did they see? Now this is something you're going to hear me say time and time again, because I think it is really important that looking out at the world and its people through a Christ-shaped lens does help us to see things differently. It helps us imagine how God might see things. You may remember a few weeks ago, I think it was 3 weeks ago, after the service, as a postlude, Robert played that song, What If God Was One of Us? You know the one? Yeah. He'd actually been inspired to do that because that morning there was a man who had slept overnight on the church veranda. And Robert pointed out, this is one of God's people. face to face with us, right here, right on our veranda. He saw that. It's been a recurring theme in our Advent group too, seeing God at work in creation, the landscape, mystic glimpses of glory as God uses matter, physical stuff, to communicate with us. But do we see it? There's a story about a Jesuit monastic house in Dublin, that's in Ireland, which for nigh on 60 years had a painting hanging in its dining room. And people just passed it day in, day out. It was just part of the furniture of the room, not worth paying much attention to. And a woman named Marie Lee Wilson had given it as a gift to them after she had purchased it in Edinburgh in the 1920s for a princely price of about £8. Then one day, someone had a close look, and they thought, this actually might be something rather special. So they had it examined by an expert in the field, who ultimately concluded it was a long-lost painting by Caravaggio called The Taking of Christ, probably worth about £20 million. 60 years, just unrecognised. Didn't have the eyes to see it. John the Baptist and Jesus, 30 years of age. And apart from the remarkable infancy stories and one notable excursion for Jesus to the Temple at Jerusalem as a youth, for 30 years, largely unrecognised. In so many ways, they shared the lot of the majority of the world's population down the centuries. Just local, small community people labouring away, living their lives from nowhere all that special. Now, if you're tempted to think, well, if I was around at the time, I would have recognised them. Jesus, how could you not? Just remember that in chapter 7 of Luke's Gospel, that incident that indicates that for a time, John the Baptist himself didn't recognise the fullness of who Jesus was. He had to send disciples to check him out and ask, are you the one? Or are we to wait for another? So it seems to me, one of the problems is not that God is so far remote and removed and unattainable, though of course God is transcendent and that which no greater can be conceived, to quote Anselm of Canterbury. A genuine difficulty is that God can sometimes be just so unbelievably close, scandalously close, on the veranda, close, in the chair next to you, close, in a broken fragment of bread, close, in a flowering garden and meandering creek and wind-rustled leaves, close. It's probably a reason that it takes, normally, decades after their death for people like Oscar Romero or Mother Teresa or Mary MacKillop to be recognised and formally declared as heroes of the faith, and that they were particularly notable disciples of Jesus, and they were spirit-filled people amongst the vast company of saints of which we are all a part. But Jesus is still active in such people in such a potent way that they and he are cheek to cheek with the poorest of the poor, or speaking out against oppressive government and the slaughter of innocents, and even being killed themselves. It can be just too close. Maybe there are people in the history of this parish who you reflect on and think, there was something about them. You could feel the spirit about them. Their very personhood and activity pointed towards a Christ-like God. It's taken time to realise, but if you had the eyes to see it a bit clearer, or hearts a little more open, and dared accept that God might be just that close, maybe it would have been acknowledged sooner. I think it's why in the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox traditions they are quite clear that the story of salvation brought by Jesus starts with the incarnation, with God assuming flesh, and that which is not God coming into contact and communion with God, and thus being brought into the fullness of God's life. The riches of the gospel are such that we will never grasp it fully this side of God's kingdom. But starting with the incarnation, hello Christmas, is a part of the good news that's highly accessible to anyone, everyone. As John says in his gospel a bit earlier, to all who accept him, he gave power to become children of God. Children of God. So may God give you eyes to see it, ears to hear it, and a heart to welcome him in. Because Jesus gives you power to embrace your identity as children of God. That's who you are. That's who the person next to you in the chairs is. That's the identity the Spirit of God builds within us. I think with Auntie Doris Akers, we sang it very well a moment earlier. There's a sweet, sweet spirit in this place. And I know that it's the Spirit of the Lord. There are sweet expressions on each face. Give us a smile. And I know they feel the presence of the Lord. Sweet Holy Spirit, fill us with your love. For all these blessings, we lift our hearts in praise. And my friends, I hope you have no doubt that when we have been revived when we shall leave this place. The Lord be with you.